Hi, everybody. Welcome to GWCIM Center for Integrative Medicine YouTube channel. We have a very special guest today, Dr. Mikhail Sogonov. Dr. Sogonov is an owner of InSitu Eco Testing, which is an affiliate of our clinic. It's a unique small consulting company specializing in indoor environmental assessments, particularly we're talking mold. Dr. Sogonov has been working with us for over 10 years. He has a Ph.D. in mycology. He's been in this field for, I think, very long time, for over 25 years. And he specializes in assessing appropriately specific molds in the house and then correlating report with patient symptoms directly back to us. And we work closely to make sure that we can improve patients' health. Dr. Sogonov completed over 3 years of postdoctoral research at the Dr. Rossman Laboratory, working on joint project between USDA and Rutgers University, identifying specific pathogenic fungi. And this was the project funded by National Science Foundation. Subsequently, he worked for one of the largest mold analytical companies as a research director. And subsequently, he started his own company. And so, Dr. Sogonov, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, thank you for this introduction.
So the reason we decided to talk today is you have a very unique way you're doing the assessments. We already had one company on our podcast that does direct patient assessment, but you're doing it professionally in the house. So talk to us about your approach. How do you do the testing?
Well, my main difference from anybody else is that I bring the microscope on site, and as a mycologist, as a PhD mycologist, I can do my own testing, which substantially improves the process, as it makes inspections more dynamic. I always know where to make the next step, and I can actually show my setup.
So while you're doing this, I just want to say a couple words. So, typically when someone is going to get a home mold inspection, if you're getting a general contractor, they're only going to collect the air samples on some random fashion based on their knowledge where to look, and then they send those samples to the lab. And basically here, Dr. Sogonov brings the lab into your house. So that's really the core difference, because in essence, Dr. Sogonov is doing what the lab would do, but in real life. So immediately having capacity to get to the meats and greets of the problem on site.
Yes, exactly this. And I do a lot more surface samples, not just air samples. And I know other inspectors, they do use surface samples, but normally not so many. And a lot of surfaces may look like moldy, but they're actually not, or other way around. So even me, after more than 10 years of experience looking at mold in houses, I'm not always sure whether it's mold or not. A lot of times I need a confirmation. Not always. Sometimes it's pretty obvious, but it's always nice to have the confirmation right away.
So I know you're quite biased, but what do you think in terms of percent of your inspection that ends up being positive for something concerning?
Probably 70%.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite consistent with what we know. We know it, and of course we're all in both of you and I are in the same area, so we live in the greater DC area in Maryland. And of course, we're talking about mostly this area, right? We're not talking about Arizona, where the climate is much drier. But here, we think that 70% of all the houses are actually molded. And so percent of people suffering from symptoms based on the mold contamination is massive. And yet it's completely underreported, underrecognized, and often very difficult to manage because you don't know what you're dealing with. So your initial step is one of the most critical ways we begin working with the patients, because we will find the mold and will correlate it with symptoms. So do you want to walk us through any typical case of yours?
Yeah, I want to show some most typical situations when mold grows, and the most common ones Well, actually, this is one. It's not the most common one, but it's more visible. It happens in humid environments when very common in basements, and you would think this is something everybody would recognize as mold, but you will be surprised how many times people have no idea that they have this mold. This is a little bit of special lighting, and plus I paid attention to it, and maybe they didn't. Sometimes people have basements they don't even go to, and they may not even know that they have mold there.
This looks like dust to me, almost.
Yeah, well, people think it's just dust, but it is actually mold growth, and could be on furniture, could be here it's some wooden studs, and on the lower part of furniture. That's very common on different dressers and tables on the lower side where people don't want to look.
So that was
Um,
under the furniture, right? That area?
Yep, that's some kind of either a dresser. No, that looks like a desk. Yeah, a little more up high. That's a louver door. Can be even on metal.
So can you pause for a second? You can go back there. So, you
Yep.
know, I traditionally thought that mold is not going to grow in a metal because there's no biologic,
Right.
there's no
Well, it cannot grow on a pure metal, obviously, because it needs some organic material to grow, but there is always a little bit of dust collected, and that amount of dust is enough for mold to grow. And sometimes someday it's more on the metal because metal seems to create higher differences with in temperature and producing more
more
um,
condensate.
yeah, because of the contrast in temperature, there is more condensation, and that's where mold starts growing. A lot of times, mold can be found inside wall or ceiling cavities, and that may happen for two different reasons. In basements, it may happen because of water infiltration through the foundation and walls. But it also happens in ceilings, and basement ceilings are a very common place. Why this is happening? This is not because of the direct water intrusion. This is again air. This is condensation from air. The
So
outdoor
what are
air.
we looking here at?
This is a thermal image, and I believe the next image is in normal light. Yeah, that's the same place. Uh, this inspection was conducted in cold weather. I believe it was December, a couple of years ago. And why this is happening? This is the cold zone, meaning that outdoor air comes into this cavity. And this cold zone is delimited by ceiling joists here. So it's just happening here in this section. Well, there is another joist on the right side. And you see this duct. This is an exhaust duct from a dryer, I believe, and it goes outside. And there is some gap in the house and around this duct. That's exactly where air comes in. And even though it's easy to find this problem in the winter, the actual mold growth happens in the summer when hot air comes in and cools down and starts creating condensation. And I did test these surfaces inside this ceiling cavity bay, and it was molding.
So this is a great example. If the standard inspection happens with a regular contractor, they'll never even consider going to a place like this because it won't occur to them that there could be a problem because they have no way of assessing this. They have no tools and they don't think about it.
Well, they might think about it a little bit. They will obviously see the cold zone because thermal camera is a tool. It's basically a must for everybody.
Hmm.
But the main goal of using the thermal camera in the most popular view is that you're looking for wet zones, which are getting cold because of the water.
Hmm.
So the most likely scenario with regular inspector will be they will either realize this is not from the water because it's too like rectangular shaped. The water doesn't spread like that. Or they may go with the moisture meter and check the water, then they will get no
Nothing.
moisture reading.
Yeah.
And probably that's where it will end. There might be some more advanced inspectors who would think about, well, maybe it is mold there because of condensation, the way I'm thinking. But for them, it will be too much of a hassle to actually take a sample in a place where I'm not even sure there is something sent it to the lab, and they have to bill the client for every sample. Um, it will not be dynamic enough, and most likely they will skip this step. Especially in this particular case, there was a different mold program somewhere else, which happened for a much more obvious reasons. There was a leak from a toilet wax ring into the basement ceiling, and it had tons of mold, very visible, and they will probably just focus on that part.
So we see this all the time. We would see that we would tell the patient you have a mold in the house because we see that you're sick. We tested the patient. It's a consistent. So the patient will get an inspector. The inspector will find something. They'll go and remediate this, and patient is not better. We see this all the time, and typically it happens because the inspection wasn't done thoroughly enough, and they didn't pick everything. They just picked the most obvious things. I don't know. This is probably half of everything we see nowadays. So I'm just highlighting it to everybody of the critical aspect of getting the right inspector for the job. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
thank you. And oh yeah, that's another common situation. Um, so this house had a lot of mold in wall and ceiling cavities, and in this case, the air was coming in not through a gap around the pipe, but because it wasn't constructed right away. That the so this here we are looking at the second floor. It's right above that. This is a garage ceiling here, and that's where the main first floor is. And the actual interior wall of the second floor would go somewhere this way. And all this space is some kind of side attic, but and it has perforation on the soffit here. So the air does come in, gets into the cavity in the attic. But unlike in um, normal attics, or above second floor or the top floor, let's say this way, with soffits, and those attics are vented. This one is not vented. It doesn't have an exit vent. So the air comes in, and because it can't get out here, and there are some holes in the wall separating the living space and the the ceiling cavity on the first floor, which is going somewhere this way. Um, the air gets in there, and there is condensation on that side.
Yeah. And so that's like completely unfixable unless you actually correct the structural problem. Like you can't just clean it. You clean it,
Yeah,
you'll get
that house was, well, it had actually more problems because there are some besides having this soffit, this house had a sheathing, like the not the roof sheathing, the wall sheathing, house angle made of fiberboard. Um, it's not super common, but I do see maybe in 10% of like typical single family homes and some townhouses from like 70s and 80s. They did use fiberboard, and fiberboard is just too soft compared to like normally used plywood or OSB. Uh, and in some cases, it was damaged in certain spots, maybe just during the construction. And when you have a hole, that's another pathway for the air to come in. And it's behind siding, but air can get under the siding. Siding obviously not airtight. So the house got completely rebuilt basically. It was fully gutted on the whole level. That's another problem. Another common place is the air conditioning systems.
Mhm.
And this is an air handler. You see coil on the left and uh, air handler wall on the right. And there are a lot of air handlers which have open fiber insulation or lining, as it's called, on the inside. That open fiber collects dust, and there is condensation there, obviously, and
Mhm.
it actually has to be because that's the way air conditioning works. And uh, well, it mainly happens on the coil, but the walls also get some of it, some of that.
So the mold is
Uh,
on the right side there where the wall is.
yep, it is inside, and this is a relatively moderate case, I would say. I was gonna show you. Oh, that's another place. Sometimes dust gets collected on the lower side. Well, lower. It's usually lower, but it has to be upstream, and
Mhm.
usually the air goes up, or could be
Mhm.
going sideways.
Mhm.
And that's where you collect most of dust, and mold starts growing there on that dust. And this is some extreme case,
Wow.
but that house was pretty moldy overall, I'd say.
Mhm. Wow. So this
Yeah,
is all goes through the AC and then people breathe all this. This looks really scary.
yeah. More. Oh, that's another situation. This is a situation which is quite rare in residential settings. Most of duct work in residential housing is either bare metal on the inside or plastic at least. Metal is a little better than plastic.
Mhm.
Um, but this is quite common in commercial. And this particular picture is from a condominium, but it's not very common in residentials. But you
So
have in
it's a fiberglass. What is this? Is a fiber?
yeah, it's a fiberglass, I believe, but sometimes it's other fibers. But I think in this case it was fiberglass lining inside the ductwork, and then the mold can start growing there. I mean,
Mhm.
it starts in the air handler, but then it may spread out. And the idea why they use that lining is that to reduce the noise, but I don't know. Choosing between mold and noise, probably I would
Definitely
choose
take a
noise.
noise. It's
Yeah,
a lot healthier for you. Okay.
yeah. Oh, that's already something else. I talk about maybe you have more questions about
Yeah,
different locations.
so thank you. So you showed us a lot of structural pieces. So I guess let's move to the talk about specific molds. So you have some of the slides talking about specific. So that next slide, I think, is a type of a mold that's you wanted to discuss, right?
Yeah, that's a mold which was uh, not very known to people. Actually, it has quite a story, and now we have a plan to maybe continue with my colleagues, well, former colleagues from I used to work before during my postdoc.
Mhm.
Uh, I noticed this fungus about 15 years ago, back in the time when I worked for EMSL.
Mhm.
It's not super common, but it was happening once in a while, and um, nobody could properly identify it in the MSL. And the best case, probably the closest identification was Ganata because it looks similar. A lot of times, especially when they would not see these structures, but only see the spore, they would even just call them basidiospores. And
Mhm.
if it's an air samples, and basidiospore is just a spore of a mushroom or like a shell fungus. And it's not even from actual mold. And usually it's an indicator of outdoor environment. But this one was definitely coming from indoor, and I was wondering what it is. So at some point, I got a sequence. I asked my former colleagues to sequence it, and I got some results. Um, and this is where it matches now. But back in, I believe, 2007, or maybe, yeah, somewhere around that time, maybe 2008, I did it. It didn't really have an exact match in gene bank, and I don't know, probably not everybody knows what it is on the picture, right? I'm showing. It's
Genetic
a
sequence.
Yeah, it's a sequence of it's a DNA sequence of ITS called internal transcribed spacer, the most commonly used marker. Um, and you can, if you have a sequence, you can search where it matches in NCBI database. So I did this search not that long, like about a month ago again, when I started to prepare for this podcast. And um, oh, actually, no, that wasn't even the reason. It wasn't about the podcast at the point. It was because I saw it in the same fungus in my inspection, and I was really wondering what it is.
Mhm.
And it actually got a complete match, but it's called Pizziza lignin. But uh, it was published only in 2021. So back in 2007, that fungus wasn't described. Uh,
And is that pathologic one? Do you think it's negatively?
Well, nobody knows.
Nobody.
That's the point. Yeah, it's not super common, as I said, but I see it probably once in 50 houses. But a lot of times there is a lot of it when it does happen.
Mhm. So I think this is just highlights the complexity of this topic, that there are even still now lots of things that are unknown. And I think that's part of the reason why we're struggling so much to treat patients appropriately, and why Richard Shoemaker and Andrew Heyman, so they're trying to do a lot of clinical research on this, and struggling in part because, again, the topic of mycology is such a complex field and with so much unknown.
Yeah, something else I wanted to talk about, going back about um, regular mold inspectors and the mainstream of mold inspections. Um, So a lot of times they take those samples from indoor and outdoor, trying to say that if the numbers indoor are lower than outdoor, then it's not a problem in the house. Well, besides having a lot of variability in space and time and just probability of random errors, um, considering how small the sample size is, uh, there is something else which makes this comparison incorrect. So when a regular inspector gets the data from the lab, um, all the results are split in specific categories of mold. Well, you think species, but they're not really species. They're sometimes genera, genuses, sometimes they're groups like ascospores, basidiospores. And this is one of the most common groups, consisting of two genera and also some similar looking fungi, uh, called Aspergillus penicillium. And both of these would be reported in the same category. One sample is outdoor, one indoor. And they are in the same category, but they're definitely different. So both of them would be in the same category. And if, let's say, the indoor sample, which is, I believe it's actually on the left, you get total numbers lower than these ones, then you would say, yeah, that's not a problem. But then this is the same magnification, and this is both of them are the most common penicillium spores, but you can tell them different. We don't know exactly the species because that would take a lot more effort to identify the actual species, but we can say this is bigger, this is smaller. So the one you're getting indoor is obviously not coming from the door. It has its own source.
So, so in terms of just a basic understanding of when the inspection is completed, then what happens? You write a detailed report, right? So can you show us a little bit of that, like what patients would expect? So this is, walk us through this. So this is the
Oh, I didn't get a complete report with the
sure,
text
sure.
and
This is
everything,
just a
but
sample.
yeah, but this is what I'm trying to do nowadays. I'm actually putting a lot of efforts to make um, the descriptions more graphical, sort of creating mini GIS, geographic information system, but on the scale of the house.
Mhm.
When I put all my findings at these kind of markers, and maybe I should make it a little bigger. So the color and the type of the border shows what kind of mold was found. These kind of lines are showing the position, whether it's in an open space or in a cavity, and all of that is marked on the floor plan. Um, these are two different levels. Then I also mark areas which are suggested for remediation. The blue shading means that all this area needs to be contained. Um, this kind of dashed line showing that the wall needs to be remediated. This diagonal line show the ceiling needs to be remediated. And this is all work in progress nowadays. I'm doing a lot of manual work at the moment, but I'm hoping to get it more automated within a couple of months. Um,
So this is
yeah.
like a separate software that you're using to do this.
Well, for the floor plan itself, I'm using the app called Cubicasa at the moment. I'm still looking for other alternatives because I'm not quite happy with the turnaround time for Cubicasa. Then I just use it. Now I'm just using Adobe Illustrator, which
Mhm.
is which is quite a pain because it's just everything is manual. But I am working on some program in Python and which would directly accept SVG files. I don't know. I'm getting too much in the IT stuff.
Yeah. So I
That's
think
my other passion.
that's good. So basically, what you would do then, so you'll give the patients the report, then the patient can decide what remediation service they would use. They will, remediators will get this and follow the directions of where the problems are, remediate that, and then you'll come back and you'll do the reinspection to make sure that everything got cleaned up. So, and I
Yeah, I
actually,
mean there are also pictures, and these markers, the round ones, are actually references to pictures.
Mhm.
So it's like normal photographs, and then there is a text format, kind of a summary of findings, then the mold remediation protocol in official language, how it needs to be done, and yeah.
Good. And so basically then the importance is you have to come back and reinspect because again, as I mentioned earlier, quite often remediation and all these processes may not be fully completed from first attempt. Sometimes problems get discovered a bit later. This is quite sophisticated. So I
Yeah,
think retesting is critical to make sure that the remediation was successful.
yes, definitely. Once remediators start removing the drywall, they find a lot more behind the drywall.
Right.
And
Right.
then, not necessarily, actually. In the ideal scenario, they would. That would be just, they would find everything right away. But
Right.
unfortunately, it does happen, and it's not just one, two-step process. I may need coming in. I will tell, okay, you keep digging in that direction.
Hmm. You know, one question comes up all the time when we find a house that looks particularly bad. And we know that some of the remediation will just be extremely expensive. This question comes up, should I sell the house all the time? Now, of course, we can't really recommend anything specific because, you know, you have to individually look at each specific problem. But, you know, when this comes up, I don't know if the patient's asking you, but they're definitely asking us this, and often counseling about this becomes quite complicated. I usually default on the idea that from ethical perspective, it's actually okay to sell it if you think about this, because only 10 to 15 or to 20 maybe maximum percent of all people are actually sensitive to mold. They're going to have a negative mold consequences because they have a right genetic makeup to unfortunate makeup to get into the problem related to the mold. So, you know, 80% of people will not have problem. And so if you feel like you know, it's just too expensive to fix the problem, it's probably okay to sell. We often tell that to patients, and I'm not ashamed of saying this because realistically, sometimes we have situations where it's not even possible to fix. You know, people may be living in the apartment, for example, and the landlord refuses to do any of this. And we've been through a variety of legal situations where tenants were suing the landlords, or they simply were trying to get out, and landlord would say, no, you can get out, but I'm not fixing. So, you know, we've seen all kinds of problems. But I think it just highlights the fact how complicated this is. And I think that each time we advocate for a given situation, we make this judgment call based on your inspection, together with patient symptoms, together with sort of how is this practical? You know, can we actually help the patient clinically if they continuously to live in this environment? I also want to mention one very important point that always comes up. Patients always ask, well, you know, can I simply just do it myself? And can I then put air filter and it'll just filter everything? And unfortunately, the answer to this is absolutely not, because often when the problem is much bigger, the air filter will only filter out some percent.
Well, the air filter is basically a symptomatic healing. That's what I call it. I mean, they remove the problem for a moment, but not 100%.
Exactly. So they don't want to remove 100%.
How long you're gonna actually, if you're using a really high quality filter, and then you have to replace the high quality air purifiers, you have to replace the filter. So filters are quite expensive, so there will be some point of time then probably the remediation will pay off if you just rely on that.
Right. And also you're gonna have to buy very high-end filters, and if the house is sizable, maybe 3 or 4 or 5. And then you're gonna have to change all those filters every few months because they're gonna get clogged up quickly. So yeah, so this is all, unfortunately, this whole topic gets very quickly very expensive and very complicated. So there is no shortcuts here. If you unfortunately have mold-related illness, you have to take it very seriously. You have to get someone like Dr. Sogonov to do a very thorough inspection. You can imagine that its inspection is very sophisticated and not cheap, simply because the amount of time that has to go into it to do this correctly. So that's actually one voice of warning for everybody. Stay away from cheap inspections because they typically inadequate. They're not going to pick up everything. So, all right. Well, any last words of wisdom for our listeners?
Well, we wanted to talk about one specific case. Do you want to do that case?
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit. Let's talk about one specific case. So show us.
Yeah, but they ended up moving though.
That's okay. That's the whole point. You know, we often try to say, look, let's fix it, but then it's sometimes just easier to move. So
you know whom I'm talking about. So maybe you can start with the medical part a little bit.
Why don't you show us, and then it'll be easier that way. And then I'll walk everybody through the case.
Well, that's quite messy basement, but the mess is not really the reason of mold. Well, partially because this house had problems. Plus, they actually brought a lot of stuff from some other moldy house, from some relative.
So this is a family where I'm not going to even say anything specific to make sure we don't identify anybody. So this is a situation where one of the partners was rapidly having cognitive problem, like developing cognitive impairment, going quickly downhill. And thank God we picked this up and were able to say, look, this is the problem. And then the patient is doing remarkably better after they got out of this molded environment with appropriate mold treatment. So walk us through what you found here.
Well, this house mainly had just overall humid basement, and they had mold on different items, and I can show some of them here. See, this basket has this white powdery material here, and this is mold. It had some minor leaks, and in one corner, you see this black stuff that was actually stachybotrys, but realistically, that stachybotrys wasn't the main factor because it wasn't very small area. It had mold, like more probably mold in this little closet under the stairs, on the ceiling and the walls there. And that's the second floor, not much better. And they had a little bit of mold inside AC, similar situation, lower side of the coil. Yeah, and more, actually you can see here on this strips. Yeah, a little bit of elevated moisture. It's a 18W only in the lower part of walls in the basement. Oh, no, that's the second part of the story. So they tried to remediate it and did it to the best they could, but I guess they somehow decided to move anyways, because even though it was remediated for normal standards, I believe their first material wasn't still good enough, or
well,
I
and
don't know.
part of it,
Why
the
did they
patient,
decided to move?
well, the part of the patient wasn't doing better.
Yeah, they didn't
You know, and
want
we
to,
still
you know.
and we still saw when we were doing the tests, they looked just marginally better. They didn't look much improved despite the most aggressive treatment. So whenever that happens, usually we basically have to tell, look, you're not out of exposure. If the treatment is applied, you're not responding to treatment. There's only two options: either you not out of exposed area, or the treatment for whatever reason is working. And the first is way more common than the second. And so they had to, I was doing a lot better after getting out. So that's the point here that I wanted to bring to everybody is, and I think that's really the kind of most important concluding point to the entire podcast, is until you get out of this molded environment, if the mold causing a problem, you're never going to solve the issue. You're going to be really sick, and you're going to continuously get sicker. And half efforts, whether it's air filtering or some partial topical simple cleanups, will never work, because the reality is you have to drop quite dramatically in terms of exposure, close to zero, until you start getting better. And I think that's the most important message. And you really have to have a whole team really working with you, because it's not trivial on making sure that that's actually happening. So let me ask you one last question. This comes up all the time. Patients often ask us, well, I'm buying a new house. Do I need to worry about mold? And I buy a house, and we did an inspection, just a regular house inspection. Right. It said looks fine, right? So what are your opinion on
that? New, like brand new, or
no, I mean, I think most people who buy houses, there's not enough brand new constructions, right? So most people who buy
I would say when brand new needs a mold inspection, and definitely a used house, needs some mold inspection. I mean, maybe even for everybody, but at least for people seriously affected by mold.
Absolutely.
I do this type of inspection sometimes too, not too often, because I suspect real estate agents don't really like to spread the word about me, because that adds them more work. They have to
and also it's not just more work for them. No, it's not just more work, but we just said that 70% of houses are potentially molded. So you may
Yeah.
say to a potential buyers, don't buy this. This is molded, or at least make sure that they try to clean up before. And in this market, the sellers may say, forget it. I'm gonna wait for another.
Well, on the seller side, definitely no. Nobody would want me there. But
Right.
on the buyer side, even not so much, because they don't want to mention, so they don't need to go through 20 different houses until the client decides
Well,
to buy it.
that's what we're saying. What we're saying is that if you
Yeah.
have a mold-related illness, when you're buying a new house, you have to inspect and you have to be absolutely certain, because you will end up spending way more money down the road potentially if you end up getting something that is molded and you didn't realize that because you didn't spend time and effort and money on the original inspection. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, those inspections are more challenging than regular ones because I have limited time. Plus, I can't really cause any damage. I can't cut holes in drywall, or
Right.
but I would catch something big, like if it's a really serious problem.
Right. Well,
Yeah,
thank you so much.
and actually, we didn't finish this story because after the client moved to the new house, they still got a bad herdsman too in one of the samples, I think, from they did 2 from 2 floors, and that's where the mold ended up with. They brought it from the old house and the dust inside this Lincoln Memorial.
So,
Well, in
so the
campground.
old house, so the old house was following them into the new house.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I think this was very informative. We took a lot of time. I think it's very important that if listeners really concerned about this, that this is done right. I hope this gave everybody enough information. Thank you so much for joining us, and wish you the best.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.